The hand came down fast. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. 200 elites in silk and diamonds, crystal glasses frozen midway to their lips, the chandelier above throwing gold light across a moment that was already too late to stop. Lady Seraphine Thornvale stood small and trembling in the center of that grand hall. Her silver hair pinned tight to the back of her head, her pearls catching the light as she flinched. And Ronan Thornvale, heir to one of the most powerful families in the country, raised his arm with the full weight of fury behind it.
Then something moved between them. I felt my own legs before I understood what I was doing. 1 second I was standing at the edge of the room, pressed against the wall the way I always stood, invisible, managed, decorative, and the next second my arm was up, palm out, and the sharp crack of contact split the silence. Not her cheek, my forearm. I had stepped directly into the path of Ronan Thornvale's hand, in front of 200 witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a wedding that was supposed to be the cleanest power move this family had executed in 30 years. And the entire room stopped breathing. Ronan's eyes locked onto mine. Those dark, unreadable eyes that had never once, not once in 4 years, looked at me like I was worth looking at. They were looking now. I didn't flinch, not even a little. And that was the moment everything changed.
Hi, viewers. Tell me something. If you saw someone about to be hurt and you were the only one close enough to stop it, would you step in or would you stay back? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know. But to understand what happened in that hall, to understand why a rejected male Omega with no rank, no title, and no formal standing in the Thornvale house stepped forward in front of the most powerful people in the city, you have to go back. Not far. Just far enough. 3 hours earlier, Ezekiel Damon had been loaded into a black car like luggage. Not harsh words, no chains. Just handlers in gray suits who opened doors and closed them behind him with the precise efficiency of people who did not think of him as a person. That was the thing about being a failed Omega variant in Thornvale territory. Nobody was cruel about it. That would have required them to feel something. Instead, they were smooth, professional. The gloves they made him wear, white silk buttoned at the wrist, were pressed so perfectly they almost looked elegant. Almost. He knew what they were for. They were so his hands wouldn't brush against anything important by accident. So he wouldn't contaminate the surfaces of the Thornvale mansion with whatever it was a rejected Omega was supposed to carry. Shame, maybe, or just the inconvenience of existing in the wrong category. Ezekiel had heard them talking before the car even pulled out of the side gate. 2 handlers, low voices, not bothering to lower them enough. They're bringing the Damon variant? Thornvale insisted. Optics. Shows tolerance. Pause, then a short laugh. It's basically a prop. Ezekiel had looked out the window and said nothing. He had learned, a long time ago, that saying nothing was not the same as hearing nothing. And he heard everything. The Thornvale mansion smelled like polished oak and old money, that specific kind of clean that took entire staff teams to maintain. He was brought in through a side entrance, not the main. Of course. He was given a small room off the east corridor to wait in, and a handler told him he would be presented during the reception hour. That word, presented, like a centerpiece. Like a show of good faith that the Thornvale family did not discriminate. Look, they even kept their failed Omega on the payroll. He sat on the edge of the bed in that room and pressed his hands flat against his knees and breathed through it the way he always did. Slow and even, like a man who was not even a little angry, even when he was furious. He had been assigned to this household at 19. Purchased, technically, though nobody used that word anymore. Contracted, they said. For years of contracts, renewals, fine print stacked on fine print. 4 years of carrying trays and overhearing meetings and being looked through by every alpha and beta in the building. 4 years of teaching himself to be invisible so completely that people forgot to watch what they said around him. Lady Seraphine had been the exception. She was the only person in this house who had ever handed him a cup of tea instead of expecting him to hand one to her. He had not forgotten that. He did not forget things. The reception hall was already loud when the handlers brought him in. Music threaded through laughter, the clink of glasses, the particular hum of 200 rich people pretending to enjoy each other's company. Ezekiel was placed near the east wall, just inside the room, positioned the way you'd position a painting. He stood straight. He kept his face easy. And he watched. That was the thing nobody in this building had ever understood about him. He was always watching. He cataloged faces, read rooms, tracked the temperature of conversations from across a hall. He had learned contracts and legal structure not from any school but from listening outside office doors while he served tea. He knew the Thornvale financial architecture better than half the men on their board. He knew it because when you are invisible, people leave the blueprints out in front of you. He saw Seraphine first. She was standing near the center of the room, and she was not right. The color in her face was gone. Her hands, when she lifted her glass, had the smallest tremor in them. She was trying to catch Ronan's eye, and Ronan was deliberately not giving it to her. Whatever she had done, or whatever she was about to say, had already reached him. Ezekiel felt the shift in the room before most people did, that subtle drop in temperature when an alpha's mood changes, the way the people nearest to Ronan began to angle their bodies slightly away without realizing they were doing it. Then Seraphine said something. Ezekiel was too far to hear the words, but he saw Ronan's jaw lock. He saw the glass in Ronan's hand tighten. He saw exactly where this was going 3 full seconds before it arrived. And that was why, when Ronan's arm came up, Ezekiel was already moving, the crack of contact, his forearm absorbing what was meant for her face, the silence that fell over the room like a dropped curtain, and Ronan Thornvale's eyes finding his dark, furious, startled, in a way they had never found him before. Ezekiel did not step back. He looked directly at the most powerful man in the room, and he did not move a single inch. He had been waiting 4 years for someone to finally look at him. He just hadn't planned on it happening like this, because across the room, half hidden behind a column, a man Ezekiel had never seen before was already pulling out his phone. And from the angle of the screen, from the way he held it low and still, Ezekiel knew with cold certainty that he had been recording this since before it started. Ronan's hand was still in the air, not raised anymore, lowered now, hanging at his side, but the shape of what it had almost done was still in the room, outlined in the held breath of 200 people who had all just watched a nameless Omega step between the Thornvale heir and his own mother. The music had stopped. Someone near the bar had set their glass down too hard. Ezekiel could feel the weight of every eye in that hall pressing against his back like heat from an open door.
He kept his arm up, not in aggression. He was not a fool, but he did not lower it immediately either. He let the moment be exactly what it was. Let everyone in the room register what they had seen. Then, slowly, he brought his arm down to his side and stepped back half a step, creating just enough space to signal that this was over without suggesting that he was retreating. Ronan had not said a word. That was the part Ezekiel had not expected. He had expected anger, the kind that came fast and loud in a man like Ronan. The dismissal, the humiliation, the immediate assertion of dominance that alphas use the way other people use punctuation. Instead, Ronan just stared at him, those dark eyes moving across his face with an expression that Ezekiel could not read, which was unusual because Ezekiel could read almost everyone. Seraphine's hand touched his arm, just briefly. Light as paper, the way she always touched things, like she was trying not to take up too much space in a world that had always given her more than enough of it. "Ezekiel," she said, barely above a whisper, and the sound of his name in her voice was the only warm thing in the room.
He did not respond. He was still watching Ronan. Then someone near the back coughed, and the room exhaled, and the noise came back in pieces, voices low and shocked, the shuffle of feet, someone signaling the musicians who started up again too quickly, a wrong note in the opening bar. The man with the phone behind the column was gone. Ezekiel clocked the empty space where he had been and filed it without showing anything on his face. A handler appeared at his elbow. Gray suit, blank expression, a hand on his arm that was firm without being rough. "You'll come with me," the man said, quiet enough that only Ezekiel could hear it. Of course he would. He let himself be walked out. He did not look back at Ronan. He did not look at Seraphine again. He kept his face clean and his pace even, and he went exactly where they took him, which was back to the small room off the east corridor, the one with the single window that faced the garden wall instead of the garden. They left him there without a word. He sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through it. In and out. Easy. The way he always did when something was burning under his skin that he could not afford to let onto his face. He pressed his palms flat against his knees and he went back through it. Every detail, every face, every second of those 45 seconds in the hall, and he filed it all. The man with the phone. The way Ronan's hand had not been the hand of a man losing control. It had been the hand of a man making a choice, and then catching himself too late. The tremor in Seraphine's fingers before it happened. The way certain people in the room had not been surprised. He had been 8 years old when he was brought to the Thornvale estate for the first time. Not contracted, too young for that, just assessed. They did that then, in the years before the reform bills, brought in Omega children from the placement networks to gauge suitability for household apprentice programs. His Omega classification had come back from the assessment board marked as non-standard, low yield, unlikely to develop predictable bonding markers. Failed variant. That was the official language. He had not known what it meant at the time. He had found out later, slowly, the way you find out most things that are designed to be kept from you, by paying attention when people believed he was not. The Thornvale children had been 11 and 12 when he was placed in the junior household staff program. They had treated him the way children treat things they are told are lesser, with the casual cruelty of people who have not yet learned to feel bad about it. Ronan had been the worst and the best of them at the same time. Worst because he had been the loudest, the one who set the tone, the one whose laugh the others chased. Best because he had also, once, only once, told the others to stop when it had gone too far. Not for Ezekiel's sake, probably for his own. But he had said stop and they had stopped, and Ezekiel had not forgotten that either. It was Seraphine who had changed things. Seraphine who had found him in the East Corridor at 9 years old with a split lip and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and had taken him to her sitting room and given him tea with too much sugar and talked to him like he had opinions worth hearing. She had not apologized for her children. She had not promised anything. She had just asked him what he thought about the weather, and then what he thought about the book on her side table, and then what he thought about the way the garden was laid out, and Ezekiel had talked, slowly at first and then all at once, and something in his chest had unclenched for the first time since he could remember. He had started learning after that. Quietly, systematically, the way he did everything. He found the books they left in rooms he cleaned. He listened outside doors during meetings he was never meant to hear. He memorized contracts that crossed through the rooms he worked in. He learned the financial architecture of the Thornvale Empire the way another person might learn a language. Gradually, obsessively, until he could read it without thinking. He learned because knowledge was the one thing they could not take off him in a search. He learned because invisible people hear everything, and heard things are only useful if you understand what they mean. He had never planned to use any of it. Not as a weapon. Not as leverage. He had just needed to understand the world he was trapped in, and understanding it had been the only freedom available to him. But sitting in that small room now, with his hands pressed flat against his knees and the image of the man behind the column still sharp in his mind, he was beginning to think that maybe the time for being invisible was running out. Because Seraphine had whispered something at the altar. He had been too far to hear the words, but he had read her lips. He was very good at reading lips. And what she had said. Those 6 words she had pressed into the air between herself and her son. Was not a confession or a threat. It was a warning. And nobody in that room had understood it except Ezekiel. That night, from his room, he pulled out the small recorder he had kept for 2 years. Slim and black and tucked inside the spine of a ledger book, and he pressed play on the last file. A board meeting 3 months ago. Voices he recognized. A name he had been waiting to hear in a context that made sense. He listened to it twice. Then he put it away and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The wedding was not a wedding. He had suspected it for weeks. Now he was certain. And the man with the phone had not been a guest. Nobody came for him that night. By morning, Ezekiel had decided that was itself a message. Not a kind one. Silence in the Thornvale house was never kindness, but informative. They had not removed him, not sent him back, not reassigned him to another floor. He was still in the East Corridor room, still technically on the schedule, which meant someone had made a decision not to make a decision yet. That someone was Ronan. He was carrying a tray of documents to the second-floor filing room, one of the small, invisible tasks that kept him mobile through the house without raising questions. When the door to Ronan's private study opened from the inside and Ronan said, flatly, "In here," not a question. But also, Ezekiel noticed, not the voice of a man who had spent the night deciding on punishment. He stepped inside. The study was the kind of room that declared itself seriously. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk the size of a small country, papers spread in a pattern that looked like chaos but wasn't. Ezekiel had been in this room exactly once before, to deliver a contract for signature when the usual staff member was sick. He had memorized the layout in 40 seconds that day. He stood now in the center of the room and set the tray on the nearest clear surface and waited. Ronan stood at the window with his back to him. He was in dark trousers and a gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, which for Ronan was essentially casual. He had a glass of water in one hand. He was not looking at Ezekiel. He was looking out at the garden that Ezekiel's room faced the wall of. "You blocked my hand," Ronan said. "Yes," Ezekiel said. "You put yourself between me and—" Ronan stopped, set the glass down with precision. "Why?" It was not phrased as a question. Ezekiel answered it anyway. "Because she was going to fall." Ronan turned then, looked at him directly. That unreadable expression again. Not anger, not gratitude, something else that Ezekiel was still cataloging. "My mother is not fragile." "No," Ezekiel said. "She isn't. But her blood pressure has been elevated for 6 weeks and she's been managing it without telling the household physician. And a strike to the face at that angle from your arm would have sent her into the corner of the display case behind her. Which is marble." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when someone says a thing a powerful person did not know, and the powerful person has to decide whether to be angry about it or interested. Ronan was very still for 4 full seconds. "How do you know her blood pressure is elevated?" he said. "I notice things," Ezekiel said. "Not an evasion. Just the truth, compact." Ronan's eyes moved across him again with that slow, calibrating look, like a man revising an estimate upward. It was not a comfortable feeling. Ezekiel held it without moving. "Sit down," Ronan said. "That was unexpected." Ezekiel sat. Ronan moved to the desk. Not behind it, but to the side of it, perching on the edge in a way that put them closer to the same level. He picked up a document from the spread on the surface and held it out. "The Allgate restructuring. Board meeting is Friday. Tell me what's wrong with the third clause." Ezekiel looked at the document. He had actually seen this document before. A version of it passed through the corridor filing system 2 weeks ago. He read the third clause once. Then he said, "The liability partition assumes the subsidiary absorbs the penalty exposure, but the subsidiary's indemnity agreement with the parent corporation expired in September, so the partition is unenforceable. The board member who drafted this either doesn't know that or is counting on nobody else knowing it." Ronan did not move. "Which board member drafted it?" Ezekiel added because it seemed relevant. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Aldous Mercer." Ezekiel nodded once. He knew that name. He had 3 recordings that included that name. He did not say that. "Where did you learn contract law?" Ronan said. It came out more carefully than his other words, like he was handling something he had not expected to need to handle. "I read," Ezekiel said, "and I listened. Your house has had a lot of conversations I was technically not in." Another silence. This one different from the first. Not cold, not charged, just thinking. Ezekiel watched Ronan process this and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the particular sensation of being seen without being reduced. It was disorienting. He kept his face level. "You've been in this house for 4 years, Ronan said finally. "Yes. And in 4 years, nobody on my staff flagged this to me." "Your staff manages the information they are given," Ezekiel said. "I managed what I wasn't." The corner of Ronan's mouth moved. Not quite a reaction. Not a smile, not a sneer. Just a shift, like something recalibrating. He stood up from the edge of the desk and walked to the window again. He stood there for a moment, and then he said something Ezekiel had not expected. "My mother trusts you." Yes, Ezekiel said. She doesn't trust many people. No, she doesn't. Ronan turned back to look at him. What did she say to me at the altar? The air in the room tightened. Ezekiel met his gaze and held it. He had known this question was coming. He had been deciding since last night how to answer it. She said, "The alliance will cost more than the contract." Ronan went completely still. "She meant the Voss family," Ezekiel said. "And I think you already knew that. I think that's why your hand went up." This was the edge of the cliff. Ezekiel knew it. He was standing right at it, laying out 6 words that could get him removed from this house by nightfall or could open a door that had been closed to him for 4 years. He held the edge without stepping back. Ronan looked at him for a long time. Then, "Friday. Board meeting. You'll be in the room." Ezekiel said nothing. He waited. "Not as staff," Ronan said. "You'll be standing beside Mercer when I ask him about the 3rd clause. I want to watch his face." That was the moment. Not an offer of freedom, not a formal shift in rank. Just a man using a tool he had underestimated. But Ezekiel understood, better than most, that tools become indispensable in ways that titles never do. He stood up, picked up his tray, moved to the door. "Ezekiel," Ronan said behind him. He stopped. "Nobody in this house knows what you just told me. Keep it that way." Ezekiel nodded once, without turning around, and walked out into the corridor. He made it 6 steps before he heard, through the half-closed study door, Ronan pick up the phone and dial. And then, in a low voice, not low enough, "The Damon variant knows about Mercer. Don't ask me how. Yes, all of it. I need you to find out what else he knows before Friday." Ezekiel kept walking. He did not change his pace. He did not let anything show on his face. They were already moving on him. He had expected that. What he had not expected was that they would be that fast, which meant someone in this house had already been watching him for reasons that had nothing to do with Ronan. He had one day to figure out who had put the second set of eyes on him before Friday arrived, and he walked into a room full of men who had been warned. Ezekiel did not waste it. He moved through the house the way he always had, tray in hand, pace even, expression clean, but he changed his route. Not dramatically, just enough. He traded the east corridor for the north passage that ran behind the main meeting rooms, the one with the loose floor panel outside the climate control access that nobody had fixed because nobody important walked that way. He had found it 14 months ago. He had used it 6 times since. He found what he needed in the 3rd hour of the morning, a conversation between 2 of Ronan's senior advisors in the anteroom off the north wing. He heard his own name twice. He heard Mercer's name 3 times. He heard a name he had not heard before, Quentin Voss. And he heard a phrase that landed in his chest like a dropped weight. "Eliminate the conflict before the board can formalize his access." Eliminate the conflict. That was tidy language for something that was not tidy at all. He went back to his room and sat with it, breathed through it, pressed his palms flat against his knees, thought. When Ronan summoned him that afternoon, through a handler, formally, which was new, Ezekiel had already decided what he was going to say and, more importantly, what he was not. The study again. But this time Ronan was behind the desk, seated, which was a different kind of message than the morning's conversation, and Ezekiel read it clearly. This was Ronan asserting the frame, reminding them both of the actual structure. Ezekiel sat down across from him without being invited to and watched Ronan's eyes react to that. Quick, sharp, recalibrating again. "I'm told you've been spending time in the North Passage," Ronan said. "I adjusted my route," Ezekiel said. "The East Corridor has a draft. The East Corridor has been the same temperature for 11 years. Then it's been drafty for 11 years, and I've only recently stopped tolerating it." A beat. And then, startlingly, Ronan almost smiled. It was brief and he covered it, but Ezekiel caught it. He stored it. "You're not afraid of me," Ronan said. It was not an accusation. It sounded almost like a question. "I'm appropriately cautious," Ezekiel said. "That's not the same thing." Ronan leaned back in the chair. He studied him the way he might study the Allgate document, looking for the flawed clause, the expired indemnity, the thing that was not what it appeared to be. The board members I trust, Ronan said. I can count on 2 fingers. The rest are managed. What you told me this morning about Mercer, if that's accurate, it changes the Friday meeting significantly. It's accurate. How do I know that? Because I have no reason to lie to you, Ezekiel said. Lying to you gains me nothing. What I told you this morning was true and verifiable, and you will be able to verify it before Friday if you pull the subsidiary indemnity agreements from September. I can tell you exactly which filing they're under. Ronan's expression shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing Ronan did was dramatic, which was part of what made him difficult. But the quality of his attention changed, sharpened into something that was less assessing and more direct. Like he had stopped testing and started listening. Why are you helping me? Ronan said. And here was where Ezekiel made the choice. Not the choice he would make publicly later in front of cameras and contracts and a room full of elites. That one was still coming. This was the smaller, quieter one. The one that happened in private, where the stakes were not spectacle but truth. I'm not helping you, Ezekiel said. I'm helping your mother. What's good for her position in this house is structurally connected to what's good for yours. Those are not the same thing, but they overlap enough that helping you is not contrary to my interest. Ronan looked at him for a long time. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this building in 3 years. Your building has an honesty problem, Ezekiel said. Yes, Ronan said. It does. He picked up a pen. Set it down. A gesture that in another man would have been fidgeting. In Ronan it read as processing. My mother told me once that the people who are overlooked in this house know more about it than the people who run it. Ezekiel said nothing. I didn't listen, Ronan said. No, Ezekiel agreed. You didn't. Another silence. This one the warmest yet. Not comfortable, nothing between them was comfortable, but honest in a way that felt like fresh air in a room that had been sealed too long. There's a private briefing tomorrow morning, Ronan said. 7 a.m. 3 board members I'm considering moving against before Friday. I need someone in that room who can tell me if what they say matches what they filed. Ezekiel looked at him. You want me in the briefing? I want you where I can see your face when they speak, Ronan said. You read people. I've watched you do it twice in 24 hours. I need that in that room. Seraphine appeared in the doorway then. Not announced, just there, the way she moved through her own house. And she looked at the 2 of them across the desk and something crossed her face that Ezekiel recognized, though he had never seen it directed at him before. Relief. The specific kind that comes not from a problem being solved, but from 2 things that should have been connected finally finding their way toward each other. She said nothing, just looked. Then she nodded once, to Ezekiel specifically, and left. Ronan watched her go. Then he looked back at Ezekiel. 7 a.m. Ezekiel stood. He picked up the tray he had brought in for cover. He walked to the door. He did not mention what he had heard in the North Passage. He did not mention Quentin Voss or the phrase eliminate the conflict or the fact that someone had already been tracking his movements before Ronan made his phone call that morning, which meant the surveillance on him was not Ronan's order. Predated it. It was someone else's. He would need that information to be a surprise. Surprises, in his experience, were the only real advantage available to someone with no rank, no title, and no formal standing in a house that was about to go to war with itself. He stepped into the corridor and the door closed behind him. Inside, through the door, he heard Ronan say to the room, to himself, maybe, or to the empty air, "What is he?" Ezekiel kept walking. He almost smiled. Friday came fast. The night before, Ezekiel laid out what he had. Not on paper. Never on paper in this house, but in his head, which was the safest filing system available to him. He went through it slowly, the way you go through a structure before you trust it with weight. The Mercer indemnity problem. The Voss alliance and what Seraphine's 6 words had confirmed about it. The recordings, 3 of them, clean and dated, stored in the ledger spine in his room. The name Quentin Voss heard once in a conversation that was not meant for him. The surveillance that predated Ronan's order, which meant a second player, unknown, who had been watching him for reasons that had nothing to do with Ronan's curiosity. And one more thing. The last piece, the one he had not shared with anyone. Not with Ronan, not with Seraphine, not even in his own private notes. He had found it 6 weeks ago in a contract that had crossed through the filing system attached to a batch of guest suite documents. One name, one signature, one date that did not match what the public record showed. It was small enough to miss if you did not know what you were looking at. Ezekiel had known exactly what he was looking at. He had photographed it on the slim recorder and he had said nothing. He knew now why the wedding was not a wedding. He knew what the Voss family intended to take. And he knew that once the board meeting formalized Ronan's position, or failed to, the window to stop it would close. The briefing at 7 a.m. was held in the smaller conference room off the north wing. 3 board members, Aldous Mercer, a woman named Constance Pryor who controlled the Eastern District interests, and a man named Halcyon Webb who had been with the Thornvale board for 22 years and who Ezekiel had heard described, more than once in lowered voices, as untouchable. Ronan sat at the head of the table. Ezekiel stood at the wall. Not seated, not introduced, invisible in the way he had spent 4 years perfecting. He watched. Mercer opened with the Allgate restructuring. Third clause, presented as solved. Ronan asked 2 questions, clean and neutral, and Mercer answered both with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was the only person in the room who knew what the clause actually said. Ezekiel watched Mercer's hands. They were very still. Too still. The stillness of practiced performance, not of a man who was comfortable. Constance Pryor went next. She covered the Eastern District contracts without notes, which meant she had memorized her position, which meant she knew it well enough to be watched. Ezekiel noted 3 moments where her language shifted slightly, just a register change, the kind you don't notice unless you are listening for it, and each time it shifted, she was talking about the Voss Alliance timeline. Halcyon Webb said almost nothing, which was its own information. At 20 minutes past 7, Ronan said, without looking up from the papers in front of him, the subsidiary indemnity on Allgate lapsed in September. Mercer, you drafted the 3rd clause in November. Walk me through your reasoning. The room went still in a different way than rooms usually went still. Mercer's hands, for the first time, moved. Just a small shift, fingers to the edge of the table, then back. The indemnity, he said, was understood by all parties to be lapsed, Ronan said, flat and final. Ezekiel did not move. He was watching Constance Pryor. She was watching Mercer. And Halcyon Webb was watching Ezekiel. That was when he knew. Webb was the second player. Webb was the one who had put the surveillance on him before Ronan had thought to. Webb had known or suspected that Ezekiel was a threat, not because of what Ezekiel had done, but because of what he had seen. Something. At some point, in some room, Webb had been worried about him for longer than Ronan had known he existed. Ronan was still talking. Mercer was backpedaling with the efficiency of a man who had done it before. Constance Pryor had gone very quiet. Ronan looked up from the papers. His eyes found Ezekiel at the wall for just a moment. A brief, quiet acknowledgement, not visible to the others unless they knew what to look for. Then he looked back at the table. This meeting is adjourned. Mercer, your documentation on Allgate needs to be resubmitted by end of business. Correctly. People stood. Papers gathered. The room began to empty. Ezekiel moved toward the door with the others. Damon, Ronan said, quiet and even. He stopped. The others filtered out. Webb was the last to leave, and as he passed Ezekiel in the doorway, he said nothing. But his eyes, calm, measured. The eyes of a man who had outlasted 22 years of Thornvale boards, moved across Ezekiel's face with the particular focus of someone deciding. The door closed. Ronan set the papers down. He looked at Ezekiel across the empty room. You were watching Webb. He was watching me first, Ezekiel said. Ronan was very still. Since when? Before you called me into your study. Another silence. The long kind. The kind where the ground under a conversation shifts and both people feel it and neither of them pretends otherwise. He's been on this board 22 years, Ronan said. He was my father's man. I know, Ezekiel said. What does he know about you? I don't know yet, but I think he suspects I have something he needs me not to have. Ezekiel paused. Then, carefully, there's a contract, a specific one. It came through the filing system 6 weeks ago attached to the guest suite batch. One signature, one date discrepancy. If that contract surfaces at the right moment, it changes who controls the Eastern District interests. And it changes the Voss alliance entirely. Ronan's jaw tightened. You have it. I have a record of it. The air in the room was very tight. Ronan looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up and he walked across the room, not to the door, not to the desk, to where Ezekiel was standing. He stopped close enough that Ezekiel could see the particular set of his expression clearly, the tension in it, the weight of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who managed information against him finally standing in front of someone who had been holding something else. What do you want? Ronan said. Low and direct. Ezekiel met his gaze and did not flinch. An official advisory role. In writing. Through your office directly. Not through the board, not through Mercer, not through staff channels. Through you. Ronan's eyes moved across his face. Not command, Ezekiel said. Not title. Advisory. The kind that doesn't show up on the org chart, but carries enough legal standing that I cannot be removed without your direct signature. That's not a small ask, Ronan said. No, Ezekiel said. It isn't. Another silence. Then Ronan turned and walked back to the desk and pulled open the lower drawer and took out a document Ezekiel had not seen before. He set it on the desk. Walked back to the window. Stood there with his back turned. It's already drafted, Ronan said. Ezekiel looked at the document. Then he looked at Ronan's back at the window. You drafted it before this meeting, Ezekiel said. Yesterday, Ronan said. Something shifted in Ezekiel's chest. Quiet and structural, like a door that had been locked so long he had stopped checking it, opening on its own weight. He walked to the desk. He picked up the pen. He signed. He set the pen down and slid the document to the center of the desk where Ronan would need to return to sign it, and he walked to the door and he stopped there for a moment without turning around. Ronan, he said. First name. The first time. Whatever Webb knows, he's going to move before the formal board meeting. Not on you. On your mother. He opened the door. The contract I found, he said, hand on the frame. I already moved it. 3 weeks ago. It's no longer in a place Webb can reach. He paused. Neither is the majority share position it controls. He stepped out into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind him. What he did not say, what he was not ready to say, not yet, was where he had moved it to. Whose name was now on the legal documentation that controlled the Eastern District's share position. Whose signature witnessed and filed through a private legal channel that nobody in this building had known to watch. Seraphine's. The wedding was in 4 days. And Ezekiel had just made her the most powerful person in the room nobody would realize until it was already over. The document sat on Ronan's desk with 2 signatures on it by nightfall. Not because Ronan had signed it immediately. He hadn't. He had stood at that window for a long time after Ezekiel left. Long enough that the afternoon light moved across the floor and changed color twice. Long enough that his senior handler knocked twice to remind him of a 3 o'clock call and Ronan had waved him off without turning around. Long enough that when he finally walked back to the desk and picked up the pen, it was not the act of a man who had made a business decision. It was the act of a man who had made up his mind about something that had nothing to do with business. He signed it, both copies, slid one into the internal document envelope addressed to Ezekiel's room, kept one in the lower drawer, locked it. Then he called Constance Pryor and told her the board restructuring was moving up by 48 hours. Ezekiel found the envelope under his door at 9 that night. He read the document twice in the dim light of his room, folded it with precision, and put it in the ledger spine beside his recorder. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. In and out. Easy. The way he always did when something was shifting under him too fast to track completely. He needed to think clearly. The wedding was in 3 days. Webb would move before then, not on the board, not directly. He would move on something smaller and quieter. A legal challenge to the shared documentation. A question about the filing chain. Something that looked administrative on the surface and would take time to untangle, which was exactly the point. Bureaucratic delay was its own weapon, and Webb had been using it for 22 years. The next morning, Ronan called him to the east sitting room, not the study, which was another shift in frame, and Ezekiel noted it. The sitting room was where Seraphine took her tea. It was the closest thing the Thornvale house had to neutral ground. Ronan was already there when Ezekiel arrived, standing at the window again, which seemed to be his thinking position. Seraphine sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace with her tea and the particular stillness of a woman who had survived 63 years in a world designed to overlook her. "Sit down," Ronan said. Then, after a beat, "Lower, both of you." He turned from the window. He looked at them. At Seraphine first, then at Ezekiel, and the expression on his face was one Ezekiel had not seen on him before. Not authority, not assessment. Something rawer than either of those and harder to name. "I've been running this house," Ronan said. "The way my father ran it. The way his father ran it before him. Which means I've been running it like a structure that needs to be defended from the outside, without asking what it's doing to the inside." He paused. "I'm done with that." Seraphine set her teacup down. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for this sentence for a very long time. "The Voss Alliance," Ronan said, "was supposed to consolidate the northern shipping routes and give us clean access to the Mercer distribution channels. What it actually does, what I should have seen 6 months ago, is hand Quentin Voss a seat at the table that gives him override power on Eastern District decisions within 18 months. He doesn't need to take the house. He just needs to wait." He looked at Ezekiel. "Tell me I'm right." "You're right," Ezekiel said. "How long have you known?" "I suspected it in September. I confirmed it 6 weeks ago." Ronan held his gaze. "And you said nothing." "I had no standing to say anything," Ezekiel said. "A rejected Omega with no formal role tells the Thornvale heir that his biggest alliance is a long-play hostile acquisition. That conversation ends with me removed from the house and the information buried." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the specific care of a man choosing his words because he means them, "That's not an excuse. That's a structural failure I created." It was the last thing Ezekiel had expected him to say. He did not let it show. "The reforms I want to propose," Ronan continued, moving to the small table where he had laid out documents. Not in the organized chaos of his desk, but arranged, deliberately like a presentation. "Are not going to go through the board cleanly. Mercer's block will push back. Webb will move against them through legal channels before I can get them formalized. I need them restructured in a way that bypasses the standard approval track." He looked at Ezekiel. "Which you've apparently already started." Seraphine made a small sound that, in another woman, might have been a laugh. "The share position," Ezekiel said carefully. "Yes," Ronan said. "The share position." A pause. Seraphine looked at Ezekiel over the rim of her teacup. Her eyes were steady and warm and completely calm, like a woman who had known this conversation was coming and had prepared herself for it. Ezekiel looked back at her, then at Ronan. "When she exercises that position," Ezekiel said, "she becomes the largest single non-board shareholder in the Eastern District interests. That gives her advisory override on any board vote that touches Eastern policy. Webb's leverage on the Voss Alliance goes to zero because the alliance requires unanimous advisory approval to proceed, a clause that was written into the original charter in 1987 and has never been used because nobody has ever held a position big enough to invoke it." The room was very quiet. Ronan sat down. He looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked up at Ezekiel with an expression that was not quite readable. Not the cold assessing look he had used in the study, not the raw openness of a moment ago. Something between them, something that was still deciding what it was. "You did this 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes," Ezekiel said, "before I invited you into the study." "Yes. So you were already—" Ronan stopped, started again. "You were already protecting her. Before any of this. Before I knew you existed. She was the only person in this house who ever treated me like one," Ezekiel said. Simply, without performance. Just the fact set down clean. Ronan absorbed that. His jaw worked slightly. Then he nodded once. The compressed nod of a man accepting something too important to acknowledge with more words, and turned back to the documents. They worked through the morning together. Ezekiel at the table with the policy documents, Ronan across from him, Seraphine occasionally offering a word or a question that reframed an entire section in a direction neither of them had considered. It was the first time in 4 years Ezekiel had sat at a table in this house and been given room to think out loud. It was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with how unfamiliar the sensation of being heard was when you had built your entire survival on no one listening. At noon, a handler appeared in the doorway and said, quietly, that Aldous Mercer had filed a formal procedural challenge to the Eastern District filing chain, effective immediately, which meant he had found the share documentation, not its content but its existence. And he was already trying to quarantine it before anyone could read it. Ronan looked at the handler, then at Ezekiel. How long do we have? 48 hours, Ezekiel said, before a procedural challenge can compel disclosure. After that, the filing is public record and the challenge is moot. He paused. But there's a rival mafia family connected to the Voss side, the Delacroix network. They operate through legal channels, but they have people inside 3 district courts. If they file parallel to Mercer's challenge, they can extend the compel window to 72 hours. Can they file that fast? They already have, Ezekiel said. I saw the draft order 3 days ago in Quentin Voss's briefing package. It was in the stack outside his guest room. He left it on top. That wasn't a compliment, Webb said. I know, Ezekiel said. I took it as one anyway. Webb studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor without another word. Ezekiel stood there for a moment in the empty hall. Then he took out his phone and sent one message, 2 words, to a number he had found 3 days ago after going back through every exterior camera log in the East Wing system, and he waited. The response came in 40 seconds. He read it. He put his phone away. The man with the phone had a name, Devereaux Cole, freelance investigative journalist. He had been hired not by Webb, not by Voss, by a progressive governance nonprofit that had been documenting Omega rights violations in elite household structures for 3 years. He had not been there to destroy Thornvale. He had been there because someone had tipped him that the wedding was the event where the structure would show itself most clearly. And what he had recorded. Ronan's raised hand, Ezekiel's arm coming up, the frozen room, the chandelier gold across that single frozen second, had not been published. Not yet. Devereaux Cole was holding it. Waiting. Ezekiel understood immediately why. He wasn't waiting for a better moment to publish. He was waiting to see what Ezekiel would do next. The wedding was tomorrow. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon. Seraphine would be there. Quentin Voss would be there. 200 witnesses. And Devereaux Cole somewhere in that crowd with footage of the moment everything had almost broken open, and a decision about what to do with it that was apparently contingent on Ezekiel. He walked back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He pressed his palms flat against his knees. He breathed. He had one night to decide how tomorrow ended. The wedding began at 4 and by 4:17 the room already knew something was wrong. Not obviously. Not in the way things announce themselves in movies, with music that drops or lights that flicker. In real life, the wrong note is quieter. It was the angle of Quentin Voss's jaw as he watched the processional. It was Halcyon Webb, seated in the 3rd row, who had not looked at the altar once. It was the way Mercer kept touching his phone in his jacket pocket. Small checks, every 90 seconds, like a man waiting for a signal. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the room, in his usual position, in his white gloves, pressed against the east wall where the light did not reach well. He watched all of it. He tracked every face, every shift, every body that was oriented wrong for the occasion. He had done this 4 years of mornings, and it had never mattered less and never mattered more than it did right now. The ceremony itself was traditional. An officiant who had married 3 generations of Thornvale family. Flowers that had cost more than most people's rent. The bride, a composed woman named Celeste Voss, Quentin's niece, which was the particular detail that had made the whole alliance geometry click into place 6 months ago when Ezekiel had first mapped it. Standing at the altar with the practiced stillness of a woman who had been told exactly what this marriage was for and had made her peace with it, Ronan stood beside her. He was in dark formal dress, which on him read as armor. His jaw was set. His eyes were forward. He was not looking at Celeste. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at a point above the altar like a man holding himself in place by pure will. Seraphine sat in the front row. She wore pale blue, the same color she had worn at the reception, which Ezekiel recognized as intentional, though nobody else in the room would. She had the share documentation in her bag. The advisory override filing was processed. Everything Ezekiel had built was in position. All of it came down to whether she could get to her feet at the right moment and say the 6 words that would activate it before Quentin Voss made his move. The officiant reached the section of the ceremony where objections are invited. It was not a formality. It was never purely a formality in a room this charged, and the silence that followed the invitation was the longest 3 seconds Ezekiel had experienced in 4 years. Seraphine did not stand. Someone else did. Quentin Voss rose from his seat in the 5th row unhurried, as if he had been planning this gesture for months, because he had, and said, in the clear, carrying voice of a man who owned rooms, "I have a matter of public record." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder. The share transfer made 3 weeks ago in Lady Seraphine's name was executed using documentation that includes a forged witness signature on the original filing. I have the authentication report here. The room shifted. That collective, expensive exhale. Ronan went very still at the altar. Ezekiel's mind moved fast and cold. Forged witness signature. That was new. He went through the filing in his head. Every element, every name, every step of the chain. He had checked it. He had checked it twice. The witness on the original filing had been a notary in the district clerk's office. He had verified the registration number himself. There was no forge. And then it hit him. Webb had not been abstaining at the board meeting. He had been finalizing. He had used the 48 hours of the procedural challenge as cover to have someone manufacture a forged witness claim against the notary's signature. A retroactive challenge. Not to the transfer itself. To the chain of authentication. It was beautiful in the way that very dangerous things sometimes are. And it would take weeks to disprove through normal channels. Ronan stepped forward from the altar. His voice was flat and controlled. "This is not the venue. This is the only venue," Voss said, with the smile of a man who is very comfortable. "Because in 24 hours this family will be in litigation, and the alliance that was dissolved yesterday will be reinstated under the first right provision, which, despite your filing this morning, has not been fully addressed. You moved fast, Mr. Thornvale. You didn't move fast enough." He was looking at Ronan. The room was looking at Ronan. And Ronan, Ezekiel could see it from across the room. Ronan's jaw was locked and his hand was rising slightly, the precise muscle memory of a man whose anger was getting ahead of his judgment. The exact gesture Ezekiel had stepped in front of 3 days ago. Ezekiel moved. Not toward Ronan. Not toward Voss. Toward the center of the room, directly, with the specific unhurried pace of someone who has already decided and is simply arriving at the conclusion. He stopped in the open space between the seated guests and the altar, where everyone could see him. He turned to face the room. He pulled off the white gloves. Both of them, one at a time, unhurried, and dropped them. The room went absolutely silent. A screen behind the altar, installed for the photo display during reception, which Ezekiel had specifically chosen not to disable during setup, flickered to life. Devereaux Cole, who had been given access to the audiovisual system through a contact Ezekiel had identified 3 days ago, pressed play from somewhere in the crowd. The first document that appeared on the screen was the original filing chain for the share transfer. Clean. Time-stamped. Every link in the authentication verified. And beside it, the specific authentication report that Voss was holding in his hand, pulled from the folder and photographed by a member of Ezekiel's 2-person support network at 6 a.m. that morning when it had been left, briefly, in an unsecured briefcase in Voss's guest room, annotated line by line in red. 3 discrepancies in the document metadata. The authentication report that Voss was holding was dated 3 days ago. The notary signature it claimed to challenge had been registered and verified 18 months before that date. The report was not a discovery. It was a construction. The room was reading. All 200 people reading because the screen was large and the annotations were clear and the discrepancy was not subtle. Ezekiel looked at Quentin Voss. He said, in the level, carrying voice of a man who had spent 4 years listening and was now, for the first time, speaking into a room that was listening back. The authentication report you're holding was manufactured 3 days ago. The metadata doesn't match the date of the event it claims to document. The notary whose signature it challenges has an active registration that was verified this morning and has never lapsed. He paused. The legal term for what you've brought into this room is fraud. In front of 200 witnesses. Voss stared at him. Not with the smooth confidence of a moment ago. With something different. The specific expression of a man whose geometry has been disrupted and who is still trying to locate where it went wrong. Then Seraphine stood up. She did not rush. She turned from the front row and faced the room with the straightness of a woman who had been in this house 63 years and had earned every inch of the ground she was standing on. She reached into her bag and set the advisory override documentation on the nearest chair beside her, visible to everyone in the first 3 rows. She looked at the board members she could see. Mercer, Pryor, Webb at the far edge. And she said, in the voice she used for important things, which was quieter than most people expected but carried perfectly, I am invoking the advisory override provision of the 1987 Charter. The Eastern District interests are no longer subject to board vote on this matter. The Voss alliance is closed. Permanently. Webb did not move. But something in his face, just for a moment, just 1 second, changed. Not defeat. Not surrender. The expression of a man who had seen a game he thought he understood played by rules he had not known were on the table. The room erupted. Not chaos. Controlled noise, the specific sound of 200 people processing a reality shift, voices low and shocked and multiplying. Ronan stood at the altar and he was looking at Ezekiel. Not at Voss, not at Webb, not at the screen. At Ezekiel. Those dark, unreadable eyes that had never looked at him until 3 days ago. Looking at him now with an expression that was, finally, fully readable. It was not gratitude. It was not surprise. It was the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time that had been there all along, and understanding exactly what it cost the other person to have stayed when leaving would have been easier and safer and kinder to themselves. Voss was still standing. He set the folder down on the seat beside him. He looked at Ezekiel for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. Then at Ronan. He picked up his jacket, and without another word, he walked toward the exit at the back of the room. His family followed. At the door, he stopped. He looked back at Ezekiel once more. You're just an omega, he said. It came out quiet, almost without heat. The last card a man plays when all the others are gone. An identity reduction. A category. A reminder. Ezekiel looked at him across the length of the room. Yes, he said. I am. And then, evenly, without cruelty and without performance. And I restructured your entire 12-year strategy in 72 hours using a recorder, a ledger book, and the things people said in front of me because they believed I wasn't listening. You might want to rethink your hiring process. The door closed behind Quentin Voss. Devereaux Cole stepped out from behind the audiovisual console and lowered his phone. He had not just broadcast the documents. He had live-streamed the last 6 minutes through 4 channels. It was already moving. Ronan walked down from the altar. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of Ezekiel and he said, low enough that only Ezekiel could hear it, "Why did you do all of this?" Ezekiel looked at him. He remembered the cold reception hall 3 days ago. The white gloves. The word presented. The weight of being led into a room like an accessory. He remembered Seraphine's hand on his arm, light as paper. He remembered the first time she had asked him what he thought and waited for the answer. He said, because power shouldn't punish compassion, and neither should a house. Ronan held his gaze for a long time. The room was still loud around them, voices, movement, the specific chaos of a reality being reordered, but in the space between them it was very quiet. The kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. Celeste Voss walked past them both toward the exit, with the particular relief of a woman who has just been freed from something she had agreed to under circumstances she could not discuss. She caught Ezekiel's eye as she passed. She nodded once. He nodded back. Webb was still seated when the room emptied. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, the same posture Ezekiel used, which was interesting, and he looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up at Ezekiel across the emptying hall. He said nothing. He stood up. He walked to the exit. He did not look back. Mercer left next. Then Pryor. Then, in pairs and small groups, the 200 guests, rearranging themselves into the story they would tell about this afternoon for the rest of their lives. Most of them not yet understanding that the story was not about Ronan Thornvale or Quentin Voss or a failed wedding. It was about who had been standing at the east wall in white gloves, watching. The morning after the wedding that wasn't a wedding, the city woke up to a live stream. 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Played 400,000 times before noon. Commentary sections filling faster than platforms could moderate them. Not with hate, which the story had braced for, but with something more disorienting. Recognition. The specific, complicated recognition of people who had spent their lives in rooms where they were managed and overlooked and told their silence was circumstance. Watching a man in white gloves walk into the center of a space he had no formal standing in, and dismantle a 12-year structure with documents and recordings and the things people said when they thought nobody important was listening. By afternoon, 3 separate governance reform organizations had issued statements. By evening, the clip of Ezekiel pulling off the white gloves, just that, nothing else, the 2-second gesture of a man setting something down, was the most shared video segment on 2 platforms. He did not watch any of it. He was in the East Garden, which faced the wall his room had always looked at, sitting on the low stone bench where he had learned to breathe through difficult mornings during his first year in this house. The garden was overgrown in the good way. Something Seraphine had allowed deliberately because she believed, she had once told him, that things that were allowed to be imperfect lasted longer than things kept too carefully. He had thought about that a great deal over the years. Seraphine found him there at 10 in the morning. She sat beside him on the bench without asking, which was how she had always operated, without asking permission for things she had every right to. She had a cup of tea in each hand. She gave him one. They sat for a while without talking. The garden was cool and the light was doing the slow morning shift across the stone walls, and somewhere beyond the east gate the city was processing 6 minutes and 43 seconds that were changing the shape of a conversation that had been going in one direction for a very long time. The board convened this morning, Seraphine said finally, without Ronan, at Webb's request. Ezekiel held the teacup in both hands. How did it go? Webb resigned, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the garden, at the particular patch of moss along the low wall that had been there as long as he had. He submitted a formal statement, she continued. He acknowledged the share structure, acknowledged the override, and tendered his resignation effective immediately. She paused. He did not acknowledge anything else. No, Ezekiel said. He wouldn't. He's not a bad man, Seraphine said. No, Ezekiel agreed. He's a loyal one. He was loyal to a version of this house that doesn't exist anymore. Those things aren't the same as bad, but they produce the same results eventually. She nodded slowly. She turned her teacup in her hands. Mercer submitted a corrected all-gate restructuring. All 4 clauses. Ronan has a meeting with him this afternoon. Pryor. She called this morning. She wants a conversation about the Eastern District going forward. She was careful about what she said, but what she meant was clear. Seraphine almost smiled. She picked the right side. She just waited longer than she needed to. Ezekiel drank his tea. It was the same kind she always made, too much sugar, which he had learned to like. He looked at the garden wall and at the moss and at the specific quality of morning light that made everything in this corner of the estate look like it had been arranged with care, even though it had mostly been left alone. The override filing holds, he said. Yes, I spoke with the district clerk's office this morning. The legal remedy classification is confirmed. The first right option is dead. She looked at him. You knew about that exclusion clause before I knew to look for it. Your husband put it there, Ezekiel said. I don't think he intended it for you specifically. I think he intended it as general protection against hostile remedial claims. But the language was broad enough. And you found it. I find things, he said. Another quiet. A bird landed on the far wall and regarded them and left. Ronan wants to restructure the advisory role, Seraphine said. Make it formal. A new position. He's drafted the language himself. He wants you to look at it. Ezekiel looked at his tea. What does the position include? Access to all board documentation. Direct advisory standing with a formal vote on matters of household policy that affect non-standard staff classifications. She paused. And a salary. An actual one. Retroactive. He said nothing for a moment. He thought about the word retroactive. About 4 years of mornings with a tray in his hands and white gloves on. Carrying contracts through corridors that he had read and filed in his head because there was nowhere else to put them. About the specific weight of invisibility when it is not chosen but assigned. About what it meant for a house to formally acknowledge that the assignment had been wrong. It won't change how the rest of the world sees an Omega in an advisory role, he said. No, Seraphine agreed. It won't. Not immediately. But it changes one house. And houses are where most people live their lives. He thought about that. He thought about Devereaux Cole and the live stream and 400,000 views before noon and the governance reform organization's filing statements. He thought about Celeste Voss walking out of that hall with the relief of a woman who had been freed. He thought about Webb resigning with a formal statement which was its own form of acknowledgement. Not the one that gets spoken but the one that gets witnessed. He thought about the clip of the white gloves. The formal Omega governance debate, he said. The one that started last night online. Someone in the Reform Network is going to request a statement from me. Probably, Seraphine said. I don't want to be a symbol, he said. I don't want to be the face of a movement I didn't intend to create. You don't have to be, she said. You just have to be honest about what happened. That's usually enough. Ronan appeared at the garden door. Not announced, just there, which was Seraphine's habit and apparently slowly becoming his. He looked at them on the bench. Seraphine with her tea, Ezekiel with his, and something crossed his face that was too complicated to fully name. Something made of the last 72 hours and the 4 years before them and the particular expression of a man who has revised his understanding of something important and is not entirely finished revising it. He walked across the garden and sat on the other side of Ezekiel on the bench. The three of them sat in a row on the low stone seat with the overgrown garden in front of them and the city beyond the wall still processing 6 minutes and 43 seconds that were changing something. I looked at the draft language, Ezekiel said after a moment. Ronan looked at him. And Clause 4 needs to be rewritten. The vote threshold for household policy decisions is set at simple majority. For protections to be meaningful for non-standard classifications, it should require a 2/3 majority to reverse any advisory recommendation. Otherwise, it's a formality. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll fix it. And the salary structure, Ezekiel said. It should be indexed, not fixed. The current language ties it to the administrative staff band, which the board controls. If you index it to the advisory board rate instead, I can't be defunded through a staff restructuring. You already thought about how they'd come at it, Ronan said. I always think about how they'd come at it, Ezekiel said. Ronan looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the garden wall. Then at his own hands, which were still, the deliberate stillness of a man who had learned to manage his anger carefully and was getting better at it. I owe you more than a contract, Ronan said, quiet and direct. You owe me a 2/3 majority threshold in Clause 4. Ezekiel said. Seraphine made the small sound that might have been a laugh. This time she let it be a laugh. Ronan looked at Ezekiel. The dark, direct eyes. Not unreadable now. Just careful. The eyes of a man who is learning something new about what it looks like to see someone clearly without reducing them to what they're useful for. "Why did you stay?" he said. "For years. With everything you knew. Everything you could have used. Why did you stay?" Ezekiel looked at the garden. At the moss on the wall and the overgrown corner and the imperfect, enduring quality of things that had been allowed to be themselves. "Because leaving would have meant the house won," he said. "And I decided a long time ago that the people who overlook you don't get the satisfaction of also losing you. They have to live with the fact that you stayed, that you saw everything, and that, in the end, you were the one who chose mercy." He paused. "That's harder for them than punishment. Punishment they understand. Mercy, from someone they dismissed, that stays with them." The garden was quiet around them. The morning light had moved fully across the stone walls and was warm now, the specific warmth of late morning, the kind that makes even overgrown things look deliberate. The three of them sat with that for a while. Somewhere across the city, 400,000 views were becoming 600,000. Governance reform organizations were citing a case they were already calling the Thornvale precedent. Online, in comment sections and town halls and the specific corners of the internet where people who had spent their lives being managed and overlooked found each other, a conversation was starting that was not yet fully formed but was beginning to have the shape of something that would not stop. Ezekiel did not sign the contract that morning. Not because he was refusing, but because he rewrote Clause 4 first and indexed the salary, and added a provision about documentation access that the original draft had not included, and handed it back to Ronan with a note that said, "This is what it looks like when it's done correctly." Ronan read it. He picked up the pen. He signed. That afternoon, Ezekiel sat in his room, the same room with the window that faced the garden wall. And he looked at the wall and he thought about the first morning he had sat here, 19 years old, newly contracted, wearing gloves he had not chosen. He thought about what he had understood then and what he had not. He thought about the recordings in the ledger spine and the contract in the bottom drawer and the live stream on 4 platforms and the governance debate that was going to need careful, measured, honest voices before it became something unrecognizable. He thought, the people you overlook often understand your world better than you do. He had understood this house completely. He had understood its structure and its blind spots and its long plays and its fears. He had understood Seraphine when no one was looking. He had understood Ronan before Ronan understood himself. He had understood Webb's loyalty and Mercer's calculation and Pryor's careful positioning. He had understood all of it from the east wall, with a tray in his hands and white gloves on, because when you are invisible, people leave the blueprints out. He had been overlooked for 4 years. He had used every single day of it. And now the house was different. Not perfect. Not clean. Not healed in the way that stories make things heal when they have 60 minutes to resolve. But changed at the load-bearing level, in the place where the structure meets the foundation. Changed in the way that things change when the people who understand a system finally get the standing to say what they know. He was the same person he had been that first morning. Same hands. Same mind. Same recorder in the ledger spine. The only thing different was that now the house could see him. And he had decided, carefully, without performance, in the private accounting he kept for himself, that being seen, when it was earned and when it was honest and when it came with 2/3 majority thresholds and index salary provisions and clause-by-clause documentation, was something worth staying for. He looked at the window, at the garden wall beyond it, with its moss and its imperfect stone. He breathed in and out, slowly, the way he always had. Then he picked up a pen. He opened a clean page, and he began to write. Not a strategy, not a legal structure. Just the truth of what had happened in the plainest language he knew, for the people who were going to need to hear it. The ones in other houses, other corridors, other rooms where they stood at the wall with trays in their hands and white gloves on, watching. The ones who had been told they were failed variants. Non-standard, low yield, unlikely to develop into anything worth watching. He wrote for them. He wrote, "Silence is not the same as absence. And the people who overlook you are not seeing clearly. They are seeing what they need to see to keep the structure intact. The structure is not intact. It was never as solid as it appeared. And the ones standing quietly at the edge of the room, watching, learning, recording, they know exactly where every crack is. He wrote, "Stay. Not because the house deserves your patience. Stay because leaving too early means someone else inherits the blueprint you already understand. Stay and learn it completely, and when the moment comes, and it will come, step forward. Not with anger, with everything you've been quietly building. Step forward. That is all it takes. Step forward. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody thought to watch, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below with the one word that describes what Ezekiel represented to you. One word. Let's see what this community says. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because the next story coming to this channel is one that will stop you cold in the first 30 seconds. You do not want to miss it. Stories that move people, challenge systems, and remind the world what quiet strength actually looks like. That is what we build here together. See you in the next one.